Welcome to the Allison Knows podcast. Are you ready to dive in with me? You guys sent me a ton of sources about what happened after the 2020 election. Excerpts from books, articles, even personal notes. So it looks like we're in for a wild ride today. Specifically, we're going to be taking a look at Donald Trump's actions and what kind of impact they had on American democracy.
And it's really fascinating the way these sources give us a different perspective. It's not just about what happened, but it's like we're getting to see what was going on behind the scenes in the Trump White House. Like, what was Trump thinking?
Yeah.
What were his people up to? And who pushed back against him, maybe even in surprising ways.
So it's not just the what, but the why behind it all.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the big things that comes through in all this is how Trump, when he was facing defeat, he just went all out to attack the very heart of American democracy.
Okay, that sounds pretty intense. How did he actually go about attacking democracy?
Well, the sources point to 5 main things he did: spreading all this misinformation, pressuring officials, trying to make legitimate election results look bad, finding loopholes in the law, and probably most scary of all, basically inciting violence. All this built up to January 6th at the Capitol, which shows you how serious all this was.
Wow, that's heavy stuff. Let's break it down. First, the disinformation campaign. He didn't just tweet rigged election over and over, did he?
No, it was way more thought out than that. Remember those early claims about mail-in ballots, like being sold or tossed in rivers? Or when Trump declared victory before all the votes were even counted? This was all about planting seeds of doubt in the system before, during, and after the election. And it wasn't just Trump himself. Certain media outlets and those social media sites, they played a big part in spreading this stuff, creating these, echo chambers where the same false claims just kept bouncing around.
It's kind of crazy how a lie, if you hear it enough, starts to feel real.
Yeah, it's a psychological thing, and it was used really effectively in this whole situation. But it went beyond just making people doubt. Trump was actively trying to change the election's outcome by putting a ton of pressure on certain officials.
Right, like what happened with Brad Raffensperger, the Georgia Secretary of State. That phone call where Trump asks him to just find enough votes is unbelievable.
That call, it wasn't just a casual ask. It was him straight up trying to mess with the election process. And then he invited those lawmakers from Michigan, trying to get them to undo Biden's win there. Again, trying to change the outcome with intimidation and, kind of bullying them. This wasn't a one-time thing. It was a pattern.
It was like something out of a political thriller, but this actually happened. And it wasn't some secret operation. It was happening right out in the open. Makes you wonder what else was going on behind the scenes.
That's where the whole idea of loyalty within the Trump White House becomes super important. What we see from these sources is that being personally loyal to Trump became the most important thing, even more than experience, knowledge, or even just the plain truth.
So it wasn't enough to agree with his policies. You had to show total devotion to Trump as a person.
Exactly. The sources describe this like systematic purge of officials who were seen as not loyal enough, and this started back in early 2020. And it wasn't public. This was all happening quietly behind the scenes. They were weeding out anyone they thought was a threat.
Wait, a hidden campaign? How do we even know about it if it was so secret?
The sources have some pretty convincing evidence. They talk about Johnny McEntee, the guy in charge of presidential personnel, who was basically the enforcer for this loyalty crusade. He wasn't just looking at policy disagreements. He was looking for any signs of personal betrayal.
That sounds pretty intense. What kind of stuff did McEntee do?
Imagine someone going through everyone's social media, checking how they voted, even looking into why someone at the Justice Department voted in a Democratic primary. It was all about figuring out how loyal people were to Trump. That was McEntee's whole world. His job was to get rid of anyone who didn't show total, absolute devotion to the president.
Wow. So who are some of the people who got caught up in this loyalty purge?
Some are pretty famous cases. Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense, he got fired partly because he banned the Confederate flag from military bases, which Trump saw as like a betrayal of his base. Then you have Bill Barr, the Attorney General, who Trump turned on because Barr said publicly that there was no proof of widespread election fraud. If you didn't agree with the stolen election story, even if you had facts, you were basically betraying Trump.
And, of course, you can't forget about Mike Pence. It's unbelievable how Trump turned on his own vice president, someone who'd been so loyal throughout his presidency, just because Pence wouldn't overturn the election results.
Pence's situation really shows how loyalty was like a transaction in the Trump White House. It wasn't about values or principles. It was about obeying and doing what you were told. When Pence wouldn't go along with this plan to basically throw out the Constitution, he became the enemy. And this raises a really disturbing question. How did this obsession with loyalty affect actual policy decisions?
Right. Did it mean that important decisions were made just to make Trump happy, not because they were good for the country? That's a scary thought.
That's a big question these sources make us think about. If people who disagreed were silenced and no one was allowed to think critically, how did that affect how the administration handled crucial issues? Did loyalty to Trump ever become more important than making good judgments? These are questions people will probably be debating for years to come.
It's definitely a lot to take in. Hey, before we get back to it, let me just remind all you amazing listeners to like, subscribe, and share the Allison Knows podcast. You can find me on Spotify and YouTube. Come join the conversation.
And tell your friends, too. The more the merrier, right?
Totally. Okay, back to this whole loyalty purge. It wasn't just about personnel, was it? It was about controlling what people heard and saw, too. Trump seemed to see any negative news coverage as a personal attack, like the press was the enemy or something.
Yeah, that adversarial relationship with the media was a big part of Trump's presidency. He was always talking about fake news, calling journalists enemies of the people. But one of our sources takes it a step further. They say that Trump's lies about the election weren't just bad for his image, they were a direct attack on the whole idea of democracy itself.
So it wasn't just about bad press, it was about eroding trust in information in general.
Exactly. By constantly trashing legitimate news sources, Trump could create this alternate reality where his claims, no matter how crazy they sounded, were the only ones that mattered. That's when disinformation gets really dangerous. It's not just about spreading lies, it's about messing with people's understanding of what's actually true.
It's like he was creating his own little world where facts didn't matter, and the only thing that counted was being loyal to him. And it wasn't just the media he saw as a threat. Remember how obsessed he was with getting rid of those never-Trumpers he thought were everywhere?
Oh, yeah. He saw never-Trumpers like they were spies inside his own administration, people working to undermine him secretly. Part of the deep state he was always going on about.
Hold on, what exactly is this deep state he kept talking about?
It's this conspiracy theory that there's this, shadowy group of bureaucrats and officials in the government who are secretly controlling things, trying to stop the will of the people. It's a powerful and dangerous idea because it makes people paranoid and distrustful of the government. Trump used this belief to justify getting rid of anyone he suspected of not being loyal, even if there was no evidence.
So you've got this perfect storm brewing, a president obsessed with loyalty, a guy like McEntee purging anyone who seems like a threat, and the media landscape all fractured and vulnerable to fake news. No wonder things got so out of control.
Yeah, it makes you realize that even in a democracy like the U.S., which has been around for so long, these institutions are only as strong as the people who are part of them. And when those people decide that personal loyalty is more important than the truth and the rule of law, the whole system is in danger.
That's a lot to think about. But it's super important to understand how we got to this point. And like you said, these forces haven't disappeared. They're still around in our politics today.
Exactly. The things that threatened democracy in 2020, they didn't just vanish. Disinformation, political polarization, this pressure to choose loyalty over truth, they're all still challenges we have to deal with.
So knowing what we know now, how do we protect democracy going forward?
We have to be aware of how people try to undermine democracy. We have to be critical about the information we consume. And we have to hold our leaders accountable for what they do. We need to be alert and engaged citizens. The stakes are just too high to be complacent.
Couldn't agree more. Now, one of the sources really digs into Trump's mindset during all this, and it sounds like some people were actually worried about his mental state.
It is interesting how some sources, especially those based on firsthand accounts, give us these little glimpses into Trump's behavior that go beyond policy disagreements. John Kelly, Trump's former chief of staff, actually predicted that if Trump lost the election, he would have to be forced out of the White House.
Forced out, you mean like dragged out, kicking and screaming?
Kelly's words were pretty dramatic. He said Trump would cling to the resolute desk in the Oval Office, and they'd have to cut the chains to get him out.
Wow, that paints a pretty powerful and disturbing picture.
It tells you a lot about how worried some people were about Trump's reaction to losing. It suggests that he might have been someone who wouldn't accept defeat and might even defy the peaceful transfer of power.
Which, when you look at what happened on January 6th, makes it all the more chilling.
Exactly. The Capitol attack wasn't just some random event. It was the result of months of escalating rhetoric and actions meant to make the election results look illegitimate. It wasn't just about challenging the outcome, it was about undermining the entire foundation of American democracy.
And it wasn't just those outside the administration who were worried. Apparently, some cabinet members even talked about using the 25th Amendment to remove Trump from office.
Yeah, the 25th Amendment gives a way to remove a president who's unfit for office because of physical or mental problems. It was never actually used, but the fact that it was even considered shows how alarmed some people were within Trump's own administration.
It's crazy to think that things could have gotten even more out of control. But let's talk about some of the specific things Trump did to try and overturn the election. There's some pretty shocking examples in these sources.
The pressure campaign on Brad Raffensperger is a prime example. We talked about that infamous phone call where Trump demands that Raffensperger find enough votes to change the results in Georgia.
It's almost funny, like he thought Raffensperger could just magic up some votes out of thin air.
Ugh. It shows how distorted Trump's view of reality was, how he believed he could manipulate the system to get what he wanted. And when people wouldn't do what he wanted, he'd label them part of this deep state conspiracy against him, just making the paranoia and distrust even worse.
It's like a pattern, right? When reality didn't match what he wanted, he'd just make up a new reality where he was the victim and everyone else was the enemy.
You got it. Trump seemed to live in a world where facts didn't matter, and the only truth was whatever helped him. And unfortunately, a lot of people in America bought into this worldview.
It's scary to think how close we came to a major constitutional crisis. But it wasn't just about Georgia, was it? He was trying to influence things in other states, too.
Absolutely. Another example is when he tried to get those Michigan lawmakers to overturn Biden's win there. He invited them to the White House and reportedly pressured them to appoint different electors who would vote for him, even though Biden won the popular vote. It was a blatant attempt to ignore the will of the people and hold on to power no matter what.
It's like he was trying to stage a slow-motion coup, using the legal system itself as a weapon to undermine democracy.
That's a powerful way to put it. His actions were deeply concerning because they showed a total disregard for democratic norms and the rule of law. His main goal was staying in power, no matter the consequences.
It's definitely a dark moment in American history. But let's not forget about some of the crazy theories that were going around at the time. There's one that's particularly outlandish.
Ah, you must be talking about the Italian satellites conspiracy theory.
That's the one. It sounds like something out of a bad spy movie.
It really does. This theory, which some of Trump's allies were pushing, claimed that Italian intelligence used military satellites to switch votes from Trump to Biden. There's absolutely no basis for it, but it caught on with some of Trump's base, which shows how easily people can fall for disinformation, especially when it confirms what they already believe.
It's a reminder that we can't just ignore these conspiracy theories as harmless. They can have real consequences, like we saw on January 6th.
That's so important. Disinformation isn't just about spreading lies. It's about making people distrust institutions, creating division, and setting the stage for violence and extremism.
That's a sobering thought. But let's shift gears for a bit and talk about some of the legal arguments Trump's team used to challenge the election. There's one that was particularly controversial.
You're talking about the arguments from John Eastman, a lawyer who advised Trump. He claimed that Mike Pence actually had the power to reject electoral votes during the certification process.
Right. He had this whole theory about Pence being able to basically choose who won.
Eastman's argument was based on a very specific interpretation of historical precedents, which a lot of legal scholars say is wrong. He said that the vice president, because he's the presiding officer of the Senate, could decide which electoral votes to count, which would basically give him the power to decide the election.
It's a good thing Pence didn't go along with it. Can you imagine the chaos if he tried to pull that off?
It would have been a constitutional crisis unlike anything we've ever seen. It really shows Pence's commitment to his oath of office, that he resisted all that pressure from Trump and his people to do something so reckless.
Speaking of chaos, let's talk about what actually happened on January 6th. The sources paint a pretty vivid picture of that day.
It was a day that will always be a dark spot in American history, a direct attack on the heart of our democracy, fueled by Trump's lies about a stolen election.
The sources describe total chaos and violence as Trump supporters stormed the Capitol building.
They broke through security, fought with police, and forced their way into the House and Senate chambers, stopping the certification of Joe Biden's victory. Lawmakers and staff had to evacuate. They were scared for their lives.
One detail that really stuck with me was the story of Congressman Markwayne Mullin grabbing hand sanitizer stands to use as weapons.
It really shows you how scared and uncertain everyone was in that moment. People thought they were under attack and were ready to defend themselves.
It's a dark day that we need to remember and learn from. But let's talk about what happened afterward. What happened after the riot was stopped.
Right after there was this feeling of shock and disbelief. The whole world was watching in horror as this symbol of American democracy was attacked by a mob of Trump supporters.
Trump got impeached for a second time, right?
He did. The House of Representatives impeached him for incitement of insurrection, but then the Senate acquitted him. It was a very divisive time, with the Republican Party totally split on how to react to January 6th.
Some Republicans condemned what Trump did, while others stayed fiercely loyal.
Exactly. The riot exposed these deep cracks within the party, and they're still struggling with it today. It raised questions about the future of the Republican Party and whether they're committed to democracy.
The sources also talk about some of the warnings that were happening within the Republican Party before January 6th. Liz Cheney, for example, wrote a memo saying she was really worried about the efforts to overturn the election.
Cheney's memo was a serious warning about how dangerous it would be to object to electoral votes without any evidence of fraud. She said it would undermine the Constitution and damage American democracy for generations. Unfortunately, not many people listened to her.
It's too bad more people didn't pay attention to her. But it's not all bad news. There were some inspiring examples of people standing up to Trump's schemes.
Definitely. Mike Pence refusing to overturn the election results shows how committed he was to the rule of law. He understood that his role was mostly ceremonial and that he didn't have the power to just reject electoral votes on his own.
He was under so much pressure from Trump and his allies, but still stuck to his principles.
There's this dramatic story in one of the sources about Pence refusing to leave the Capitol during the riot, even when the Secret Service was telling him to get out. He was determined to finish the certification process and make sure there was a peaceful transfer of power.
It's a powerful story of courage, a reminder that even when things are really tough, individuals can make a difference. And it wasn't just Pence. Bill Barr, Trump's own attorney general, also refused to buy into the stolen election story.
That's right. Even though Trump kept saying there was widespread fraud, Barr's investigations found no evidence to back that up. He even called the allegations bullshit.
It's amazing that someone so close to Trump was willing to publicly disagree with him like that.
It shows that Barr was committed to the rule of law and wouldn't be part of Trump's attempts to undermine the election. It's a reminder that even in a highly political environment, people can choose to do the right thing.
It's inspiring to hear these stories of courage and principle, but it also makes you think, what if more people had spoken up sooner?
That's a question people will probably debate for a long time. Would more pushback from within the Republican Party have stopped Trump? Could the Capitol riot have been prevented? It's tough to say for sure.
It's clear that the aftermath of the 2020 election was a really wild time in American history. But it also offers some important lessons about how fragile democracy is and how crucial it is to uphold democratic norms.
We need to remember what happened during this time, learn from the mistakes that were made, and be vigilant in protecting our democratic institutions. The future of American democracy might depend on it.
That's a serious thought, but an important one. And on that note, we're going to wrap up part 1 of our deep dive into the aftermath of the 2020 election. Join us for part 2, where we'll go even deeper into the events of this crazy time. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share the Allison Knows podcast on Spotify and YouTube.
We'll be back soon with more insights and analysis. Until then, stay curious and stay informed. Welcome back to our exploration of the 2020 election aftermath.
It's been quite a ride so far, right? We've seen how Trump's obsession with loyalty really shook things up in his administration, and how his attempts to, overturn the election brought us dangerously close to a constitutional crisis.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to look at how disinformation and power struggles and moments of both, worrying compliance and brave resistance shaped this whole period. But amidst all the chaos, there's one event that stands out as particularly strange: the press conference at Four Seasons Total Landscaping.
Wait, 4 seasons total landscaping? Are you sure that's right?
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like a landscaping company.
You heard right. It perfectly captures how absurd things often got when Trump was trying to challenge the election results.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued now. Set the scene for me. What exactly went down?
Okay, so right after the election, Trump announces this big press conference at the Four Seasons in Philadelphia. It was supposed to be this huge reveal, where his legal team would show all this evidence of voter fraud.
Sounds pretty typical for that time, given all the accusations being thrown around.
Except the place they chose wasn't the fancy Four Seasons hotel. It was Four Seasons Total Landscaping, a small business stuck between, get this, an adult bookstore and a crematorium on the outskirts of Philadelphia.
You're kidding, right? How did that even happen?
Well, the details are still a bit murky. Some people think it was on purpose, like a way to troll the media. Others say it was a genuine mistake. Either way, instead of a fancy ballroom, Rudy Giuliani and Trump's other people ended up talking to reporters in a dusty parking lot next to piles of mulch and gardening equipment.
That's just wild. It's like a perfect metaphor for the whole stolen election narrative, a big, chaotic mess that went nowhere.
It does show the gap between what Trump was claiming and reality, right? He's talking about this massive conspiracy, but his team can't even get a decent venue for their press conferences.
It would be funny if it wasn't so serious. This whole thing really highlights how empty a lot of Trump's claims were.
Exactly. The Four Seasons total landscaping thing became a meme, right? It was a symbol of how disorganized and honestly ridiculous Trump's attempts to overturn the election were.
It seems like he was more concerned with getting attention, making headlines, than presenting real evidence.
Yeah, and that pattern kept going throughout his post-election efforts. There were tons of press conferences, rallies, tweets about fraud, but almost none of it held up under scrutiny.
And as we talked about before, the courts kept throwing out his legal challenges because there wasn't any evidence to support his claims of widespread voter fraud.
Right. Even with all these legal setbacks, Trump just kept pushing the stolen election narrative, which led to more distrust in democracy and divided Americans even further.
Which brings us to another important part of this whole period, the explosion of disinformation and conspiracy theories after the election.
Absolutely. Our sources really emphasize how Trump's unfounded claims got amplified by certain media outlets and social media platforms. It created this perfect environment for misinformation and conspiracy theories to thrive.
It's kind of mind-blowing how these completely baseless claims spread so fast, creating this whole alternate reality for some people.
It really shows the power of information and disinformation in shaping how people see things. In the age of social media, it's easier than ever for lies to go viral, especially when they're being pushed by powerful people like Trump.
And it wasn't just the mainstream media, right? We also saw the rise of those fringe platforms like One America News or OAN, which seemed to be catering to Trump's most hardcore supporters.
OAN was particularly bad. They were peddling conspiracy theories and pushing the stolen election narrative without any regard for the truth or journalistic ethics. They created this echo chamber where Trump's supporters could shut out reality and just reinforce their own beliefs.
It's a scary example of how easily people can fall prey to disinformation, especially when it confirms their biases and how they see the world.
The consequences can be pretty devastating, as we saw with the attack on the Capitol. A lot of those rioters genuinely believed that the election had been stolen from Trump, a belief that came from months of being exposed to disinformation and conspiracy theories.
It's a chilling reminder that words have power, and that if we don't do something about disinformation, it can lead to real-world consequences, even violence.
Absolutely. This highlights how critical it is to be able to think critically and be media literate in the digital age. We have to be skeptical of what we see online, especially when it comes from sources that have a clear agenda or a history of spreading lies.
We also need to be aware of our own biases and how they affect how we interpret information. It's easy to fall into that trap of believing what we want to believe, even if there's no evidence to support it.
It's a constant battle, but it's one we have to fight. But it's not just about individual responsibility. Social media companies need to be held accountable for what spreads on their platforms. They need to put safeguards in place to prevent harmful content and promote accurate information.
It's a complex problem, but one we absolutely have to address if we want to protect democracy and prevent another January 6th.
So let's shift gears a bit and talk about those internal divisions that were plaguing the Trump administration, especially in those final months.
It sounds like there was this constant struggle between those trying to uphold democratic principles and those who were willing to go along with whatever Trump wanted, no matter the cost.
That's exactly right. The sources paint a picture of an administration falling apart, with different factions fighting for control, and Trump himself becoming increasingly isolated and detached from reality.
This whole internal struggle was probably most evident in the clash between Trump and his Attorney General, Bill Barr.
Like we mentioned before, Barr was seen as a loyal Trump guy at first, but in the end, he broke with the president over the election fraud issue.
It seems like Barr's commitment to the law was stronger than his loyalty to Trump.
Exactly. When Barr's investigation showed there was no evidence of widespread fraud, he refused to go along with Trump's demands to pursue these baseless claims. That led to a huge falling out, with Trump accusing Barr of being weak and disloyal.
And it wasn't just Barr, right? Other officials, like Mike Pence and some people in the Justice Department, also resisted Trump's pressure to interfere with the election.
These acts of resistance, often happening quietly behind the scenes, were really important in stopping Trump from actually overturning the election.
It's good to know that even in such a crazy and divisive time, some people held on to their principles.
Their courage and integrity show us that even in messed up systems, there are people who will stand up for what's right.
It's a lesson we should all remember. Now let's dig into a specific example of this internal conflict. The sudden firing of Mark Esper as Secretary of Defense just days after the election.
Ah, yes. Esper's dismissal was the result of months of tension between him and Trump. Esper, who was a former Army officer and had worked in the defense industry, had tried to stay professional and avoid getting involved in Trump's more impulsive and politically motivated decisions.
But as Trump's behavior got more and more erratic and his demands more unreasonable, it must have been hard for Esper to stay quiet.
Right. Esper and Trump clashed over several big issues, like using the military against protesters during the George Floyd demonstrations, and Trump's insistence on pulling troops out of Afghanistan and Germany.
It sounds as Esper was one of the few people in Trump's cabinet who was willing to stand up to him.
And that made him a target. Trump saw Esper as disloyal and someone who was getting in the way of what he wanted to do. So in the chaos after the election, he fired Esper and replaced him with Christopher Miller, a relatively unknown guy who was seen as more likely to do what Trump wanted.
It seems like another case of Trump choosing loyalty over experience and competence.
That's a really important point. Miller, a former Green Beret and counterterrorism official, didn't have much experience managing a huge and complicated organization like the Pentagon. His appointment worried national security experts who thought he might be too willing to go along with Trump's impulsive and possibly dangerous ideas.
It's a warning about the risks of letting politics influence the military and appointing people to important positions just because they're loyal to a particular leader or ideology.
The removal of Esper and the quick appointment of Miller were part of a bigger pattern in the Trump administration, where experts were pushed aside and loyalists were promoted whether they were qualified or not.
It's a worrying trend because it undermines good governance and weakens our democratic institutions by getting rid of expertise and critical thinking.
Now let's zoom in on Miller's short time as acting Secretary of Defense. What were some of the key things that happened while he was in charge?
Well, the one that jumps out is the national security meeting they had right after he was appointed. Trump reportedly talked about the possibility of attacking Iran's nuclear facilities.
That's right. Sources say that Trump became obsessed with the idea of attacking Iran in his last days as president.
It seems like he was desperate to do something big in terms of foreign policy, something that would cement his legacy and maybe even make things harder for the incoming Biden administration.
And according to reports, Miller was initially open to the idea. He even put together a plan for a military strike that involved using more than 100 aircraft to bomb Iranian targets.
That's scary. It sounds like we were really close to a major war in the final days of Trump's presidency.
It shows the danger of a president having too much power and the importance of having experienced and level-headed advisors in key national security roles. Thankfully, some people were able to step in and prevent things from escalating.
It was General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who apparently convinced Trump that attacking Iran would be a bad idea and could lead to a bigger regional war with disastrous consequences.
Yes, Milley played a crucial role in preventing what could have been a really bad decision. But the fact that Trump even considered such a reckless move is a reminder of how unpredictable he was and the potential consequences of his impulsive decisions.
It was a close call, and it's something we should never forget. It shows how important checks and balances are and how crucial it is to have sound judgment in positions of power.
Beyond the Iran situation, Miller's time at the Pentagon was also marked by some questionable personnel changes. He put loyalists in key positions and got rid of those considered disloyal, continuing that pattern we saw throughout Trump's time in office.
So even the Pentagon wasn't safe from McEntee's loyalty crusade.
That's right. Reports say that Miller, possibly with help from McEntee, tried to remove officials who had criticized Trump or who weren't seen as sufficiently supportive of his agenda.
It's yet another example of how Trump's obsession with personal loyalty ended up damaging good governance and weakening our democratic institutions by creating this atmosphere of fear and suppressing dissent.
But it's important to remember that these internal divisions in the Trump administration were really a symptom of a much bigger problem: Trump's own personality and the fact that he wasn't fit to be president.
His narcissism, his impulsiveness, his total disregard for the rule of law, These were all character flaws that made him a dangerous and unstable leader.
And those flaws were on full display after the election, when he refused to accept he lost, spread baseless accusations of fraud, and pressured people to overturn the results.
It was a chaotic period that really tested American democracy and showed the weaknesses in our political system.
However, it also showed the strength of the American spirit and the importance of individual courage and integrity, even when things are tough.
It's something to keep in mind as we work to strengthen our democratic institutions and protect our freedoms.
Absolutely. We need to learn from what happened and be vigilant in protecting our democratic values. The future of American democracy depends on it.
Hey, before we move on to the last part of our deep dive, I just want to remind our amazing listeners to like, subscribe, and share the Allison Knows podcast. You can find us on Spotify and YouTube. We love having you all join the conversation.
And spread the word to your friends and family, too. The more people we can get involved in these important conversations, the better.
Exactly. Okay, back to what happened after the 2020 election. One person whose actions, or actually inactions, are particularly interesting is Mike Pence.
Pence, the super loyal vice president who ultimately refused to go along with Trump's plan to overturn the election. Our sources reveal just how much pressure he was under and the potential consequences he faced by defying Trump.
It must have been an incredibly tough spot to be in, trying to balance his loyalty to the president with his constitutional duty, knowing that his decision could have a huge impact on the country.
Imagine being stuck between a president who's demanding you violate your oath of office and the weight of history, knowing your choice could determine the fate of American democracy. That was Pence's dilemma.
It sounds like something out of a Shakespearean tragedy. The loyal lieutenant who's forced to choose between his principles and his king who's lost touch with reality.
The sources give us glimpses into those tense days leading up to January 6th, when Pence was being bombarded with legal arguments, historical examples, even threats, all trying to get him to reject the electoral votes and give Trump a second term.
And it wasn't just coming from Trump himself, right? It was like a full-on attack from his inner circle, his lawyers, even his most diehard supporters, who saw Pence as their last chance to keep Trump in power.
You're right. One source describes a really chilling moment when Trump apparently said to Pence, "You can either go down in history as a patriot, or you can go down in history as a Pence." Well, let's just say he didn't hold back.
Wow. Talk about pressure. It's incredible that Pence didn't cave in.
And what's even more striking is that even as he was getting ready to defy Trump, Pence still tried to be respectful of the president's ego. He waited to release his statement explaining his decision until after Trump had finished speaking at that rally on January 6th.
It seems like Pence was trying to walk a very fine line, upholding his constitutional duty while also trying to minimize the political fallout and avoid a direct confrontation with Trump.
It was a delicate balancing act, but it didn't work in the end. Trump, as we know, was furious with Pence's decision and didn't hesitate to attack him, both privately and publicly.
I remember that infamous tweet where Trump criticized Pence for lacking courage just as the rioters were breaking into the Capitol. It's scary to think how those words might have made the mob even angrier and put Pence's life in danger.
Absolutely. Whether Trump intended it or not, his words seemed to give those rioters permission to go after Pence, who they now saw as a traitor for not going along with Trump's plan.
And we can't forget those terrifying chants of "Hang Mike Pence" echoing through the Capitol. It's a reminder of how quickly political rhetoric can turn into real-world violence.
It's a sobering thought. But even with all that chaos and danger around him, Pence didn't back down. He refused to leave the Capitol, even though the Secret Service wanted him to get out. He was determined to do his constitutional duty and make sure the transfer of power happened peacefully.
It's a powerful example of his courage and commitment, even under immense pressure.
Pence's actions that day, in a lot of ways, redeemed him. He chose the Constitution over Trump, democracy over autocracy, and by doing so, he played a vital role in preserving the integrity of the American political system.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, individuals can make a huge difference. But let's shift gears for a bit and talk about the aftermath of the riot. The sources describe a feeling of shock and disbelief, followed by a lot of reflection and reckoning.
It was a moment when the whole country paused, trying to process what had happened and deal with the deep divisions that had been exposed.
Trump was impeached for a second time, right? Charged with inciting the insurrection.
That's right. He was impeached by the House, but then the Senate acquitted him. It was a very divisive event, with the Republican Party deeply split over how to respond to what happened on January 6th.
Some Republicans condemned Trump's actions, while others remained fiercely loyal.
Exactly. The riot revealed these deep cracks within the party, and they're still dealing with them today. It forced them to confront fundamental questions about their values and what they stand for.
The sources also point to some of the warnings that were circulating within the Republican Party before January 6th. Liz Cheney, for example, wrote a memo expressing serious concerns about the efforts to overturn the election.
Cheney's memo was like a flashing red light, warning about the danger of objecting to electoral votes without any real proof of fraud. She argued that it would damage the Constitution and hurt American democracy for generations to come. Unfortunately, her warning was largely ignored.
It's too bad more people didn't listen to her. But it's not all doom and gloom. There were inspiring examples of people resisting Trump's attempts to manipulate the system.
Absolutely. Mike Pence's refusal to overturn the election is a testament to his commitment to the rule of law. He knew his role was largely symbolic and that he didn't have the authority to just throw out electoral votes.
He was under so much pressure from Trump and his allies, but held his ground.
There's a dramatic story in one of the sources about Pence refusing to leave the Capitol during the riot, even when the Secret Service was urging him to evacuate. He was determined to finish certifying the election results and ensure a peaceful transfer of power.
It's a powerful story about courage and a reminder that even when things are incredibly difficult, individuals can make a real difference. And it wasn't just Pence. Bill Barr, Trump's own attorney general, also refused to go along with the stolen election narrative.
That's right. Despite Trump's insistence that there was widespread fraud, Barr concluded, based on the investigations, that there just wasn't any evidence to support those claims. He even went so far as to call the allegations bullshit.
It's remarkable that someone so close to Trump was willing to contradict him publicly like that.
It shows Barr's commitment to the rule of law and his refusal to be complicit in Trump's attempts to undermine the election. It's a reminder that even within a highly politicized environment, individuals can choose to do what's right.
It's inspiring to hear these stories about courage and principle. But it makes you wonder, what might have happened if more people had spoken up sooner?
It's a question that'll likely be debated for years to come. Would more forceful opposition from within the Republican Party have stopped Trump? Could the attack on the Capitol have been prevented? These are tough questions without easy answers.
It's clear that what happened after the 2020 election was a chaotic and troubling time in American history. But it also gives us valuable lessons about how fragile democracy is and how important it is to protect those democratic norms.
We need to remember what happened, learn from the mistakes that were made, and stay vigilant in safeguarding our democratic institutions. The future of American democracy may depend on it.
That's a serious thought, but a really important one. And with that, we'll wrap up part 2 of our deep dive into the aftermath of the 2020 election. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share the Allison Knows podcast on Spotify and YouTube. We'll be back soon with more insights and analysis. Until then, stay curious and stay informed. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been on this incredible journey through everything that happened after the 2020 election.
We have. From Trump demanding loyalty from everyone to his attempts to just toss out the election results, we've really gone deep. It's been a wild look at disinformation, power struggles, and moments where people either caved to pressure or stood up and said no.
One image that just sticks in my mind is the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. It was a day that shook everyone and showed just how fragile our democracy really is.
The Capitol riot, it was like the culmination of all the things we've been talking about. People not trusting institutions anymore, the spread of all this misinformation, and some people actually being willing to use violence to get what they wanted politically.
It's a day we have to remember and learn from so nothing like that ever happens again.
Definitely. We need to understand what led up to that day so we can protect our democracy.
One thing that's been really interesting to see in these sources is the role of social media in all this. It's pretty clear that platforms like Facebook and Twitter had a big part in making disinformation worse and creating the kind of division that contributed to the violence on January 6th.
Social media, it's a tricky thing, right? On one hand, it can be a great way for people to connect and share information. But on the other hand, it can be used to spread lies, create division, and even encourage violence.
It shows that we have to be careful about the information we consume, no matter where we find it. We need to be aware of potential biases and be willing to double-check things before we share them.
And we can't just let social media companies off the hook. They need to be held responsible for what's shared on their platforms and do more to stop disinformation and harmful content.
Another big takeaway from our deep dive has been the importance of individual courage and integrity, especially when it comes to defending democracy. We've seen so many examples of this, from election officials like Brad Raffensperger, who stood up to Trump, to people in Trump's own administration who refused to go along with his plans.
These are the people who remind us that even when the pressure is intense, it's still possible to do the right thing, to stick to your oath of office and protect democratic principles.
Their actions are inspiring. They show us that we all have a part to play in protecting our democracy.
Absolutely. It's not just up to elected officials or those in power. We all have a responsibility to be active citizens. Stay informed, speak out against injustice, and hold our leaders accountable.
Something else that keeps coming up in our conversation is the question of whether Trump was mentally fit to be president. Some sources expressed concern about his stability and ability to handle the stress of the job, especially during such a chaotic time.
There were definitely moments where Trump's behavior seemed erratic, and he was making decisions that seemed impulsive and reckless.
Do you think those concerns were legitimate, or was it just political attacks from his opponents?
It's hard to say for sure without more information, but the sources we've looked at do raise some valid questions about Trump's mental state.
It's a topic that deserves more attention and discussion.
I agree. We need to have a national conversation about what we expect from our leaders, including their mental and emotional fitness for office.
And speaking of expectations, another thing that's come up a lot in our deep dive is this erosion of norms and the decline of civility in our political discourse. It feels like the lines between acceptable and unacceptable behavior have become blurry.
It's a worrying trend. When we lose sight of basic decency and respect, it's harder to have productive conversations and find common ground.
It reminds us that we need to be careful about how we behave and the language we use, both online and in person. We have to treat each other with respect, even when we disagree.
Civility and respect, those are the foundations of a healthy democracy.
As we wrap up our deep dive, I want to go back to something you said earlier about learning from all this. What are some of the biggest lessons we should take away from this crazy chapter in American history?
That's a good question. One of the most important lessons, I think, is that democracy is fragile. It takes constant work and participation from all of us.
It's not something we can just assume will always be there.
Exactly. We need to be involved in the political process, whether that's voting, contacting our elected officials, or supporting organizations that protect our democratic institutions.
And we need to be more critical of the information we come across, especially online, and watch out for disinformation.
Absolutely. Being able to navigate the media landscape and tell fact from fiction is crucial these days.
And we can't let our leaders get away with undermining democratic norms or inciting violence. We have to hold them accountable.
All those things are crucial. We also need to remember that we're all Americans, even when we have different political views. We have to find a way to have productive conversations, even when we disagree, and work together to solve the problems our country faces.
It's about finding that common ground and rebuilding trust, both in our institutions and in each other.
Well said. What happened after the 2020 election was a dark time, but it also taught us about how vulnerable democracy is and how important it is to protect our freedoms.
We need to remember those lessons, learn from the mistakes, and stay vigilant in safeguarding our democratic institutions. The future of American democracy truly depends on it.
It's a sobering thought, but a necessary one.
This has been an incredibly insightful conversation. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the aftermath of the 2020 election.
It's been a pleasure, and a huge thank you to all our listeners for joining us on this journey.
And before we go, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the Allison Knows podcast. You can find us on Spotify and YouTube.
We love having you all join the conversation.
And be sure to follow Allison Knows on Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok for more insights and analysis.
Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.
Thank you for listening to the Allison Knows podcast.